Well, it seems like it's that time of the month again with the government facing a new shutdown. Recently, Vice President Vance said we are headed to a shutdown after a meeting with the other side of the aisle, which begs the question, is this any different than all the other threats or actual government shutdowns? And most importantly, what are the consequences, if any, for the economy, the taxpayer, and the markets? Well, first we have to look at the different kinds of government shutdowns because there's not just one flavor. So what exactly is a government shutdown? Very simply, a government shutdown is when a government must stop performing either some or all of its services because it cannot pay its employees to continue to do their tasks. This definition is very important because, as we will discuss in a moment, it highlights a third form of government shutdown most people are not familiar with, which is a currency failure, but we'll get to that in a minute. So there are three different types of government shutdowns. The first one is a debt ceiling government shutdown. The second one is a budget shutdown. And the third one, like I just mentioned, is a currency failure shutdown. So first, let's discuss a debt ceiling shutdown. And this is not the one we are facing right now, although we have faced this one plenty of times in the past. Prior to 1917, the United States Congress used to have to vote for every single debt issuance. Every time they wanted to borrow money by issuing bonds, they would have to vote on that particular debt issuance. Obviously, there was a lot of friction here by design. It's supposed to be hard for the government to spend your money, but Congress wanted it to be a little bit easier, so they came up with the idea of just having a debt ceiling. In other words, they could borrow up to the debt ceiling and then just use that money for whatever they were spending the money on, and the debt ceiling was put in place in order to limit the potential abuse on just borrowing as much money as possible. And as you can see, that debt ceiling worked incredibly effectively, except it didn't, because every single time the debt ceiling has been hit, Congress has just decided to vote on raising the debt ceiling so they can borrow and spend even more. Shocker, who could have seen that coming? When they do run up against the debt ceiling and they are facing the consequences of a potential government shutdown, what they are really voting on is raising the debt ceiling in order to borrow for the funding that they have already voted for and approved. And the debt ceiling government shutdowns have a little bit of higher stakes to them because if the government shutdown happens from a debt ceiling being hit and that doesn't get resolved, if it goes on too long, the government can't make any payments whatsoever. Its checking account gets completely depleted. It can't borrow more money for any of its spending, discretionary or mandatory, even interest payments on the debt, which means the government faces a potential default on its debt. Now, especially at this time in world history, if the US government defaulted on its debt payments, it's very likely the dollar would pretty quickly cease to be the global reserve currency. But again, we are not currently facing a debt ceiling government shutdown. We are currently facing the second kind of potential government shutdown, which is budget issues. So what's going on here? Well, for the government, their spending year, called their fiscal year, starts in October instead of January. And so prior to October, Congress has to sit down and they have to vote and approve on where every single dollar is that they're going to spend, how much they're going to spend, and where they're going to send that money. Now, the key thing here is that they are voting on and approving the discretionary part of the budget here. The mandatory part of the budget is already decided on. So let's take a look at some graphs so you know what I'm talking about. So first, take a look at this pie chart. This is from this CBO themselves. You can find them on cbo.gov. But this pie chart shows from 2024, so it is a year behind because they haven't made 2025s yet because it's not over. But you can see during 2024, the total amount of money the government spent was $6.8 trillion. This outside circle represents mandatory spending, which is the largest bucket of the government spending that is mandated by law. You can see most of it goes to Social Security. We also have Medicare and Medicaid, but most of the government spending does go towards mandatory expenses. If we zoom in a little bit on mandatory expenses, you can see that in 2024, the amount they spent on the mandatory stuff was $4.1 trillion. Just to put that into perspective, during 2024, the entire tax revenue was $4.9 trillion. This is why all the talks about the government being able to reduce its expenses through austerity and governmental efficiency with Doge, all that I was saying was not going to happen because basically the entire tax revenue goes towards just the mandatory spending. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. Just those four things alone soak up everything they take in taxes, which means if you were going to try and balance the budget, you'd basically have to cut out the entire discretionary part of the budget because everything else is mandatory. 4.9 trillion coming in, 4.1 trillion of that, again, as of 2024, going to all the mandatory stuff. Now, the key thing here is none of this is what they are talking about voting on, approving right now, leading up to the government shutdown. All this is already decided on. A lot of it was already decided on with the big, beautiful bill, which we'll talk about in a minute. Instead, what they're debating about right now is this middle circle, which is discretionary spending. You can see this discretionary spending amount is much smaller than the mandatory amount. And we can zoom in a little bit further on just the discretionary spending. You can see that about half of it goes to defense, about half of it goes to non-defense spending. And that non-defense spending is things like veterans benefits, transportation, education, income security, health, administration of justice, and many other smaller categories. All of these smaller categories are what everybody is fighting over right now. There's no agreement that has been made yet about how much gets allocated to everybody's special little projects and goes to line the pockets of the people that put them in power. Peanuts compared to the overall budget, but again, the disagreement here is what is causing the government shutdown to loom. If they can't come to an agreement on time, the government shutdown occurs. And remember what I said earlier about what a definition of a government shutdown is. It's when a government must stop performing some or all of its services because it can't pay people to continue to do those tasks. If they cannot decide on what the budgets are for these categories, then they can't pay the people who are running those services. All the things like the Medicare and the emergency stuff, Social Security, interest on the debt, all of that still gets paid for because that's all part of the mandatory. It's already decided on. It's the discretionary stuff they're arguing about that gets shut down. Now, do you remember the last big shutdown that we had? It was at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. It lasted 35 days. This was during Trump's first term. And nothing happened. All the non-essential services shut down and everybody was fine. Really kind of brings into light maybe one of the reasons why the government doesn't like shutdowns is because pretty quickly people look around and realize, why are we paying for all this stuff? Nothing's happening when it's not running. We don't need it. Why are they taking so much of our money to fund this stuff? You wouldn't want anybody looking behind the curtain, and so they want to prevent these shutdowns so that people just don't question anything. Now, I mentioned earlier a third type of government shutdown, and this one would be a permanent one usually, and this one is a currency failure. Hasn't happened in the United States since the Continental, which was the first currency used before the official establishment of the United States of America. It was used to fund the Revolutionary War, but it has happened plenty of times throughout history in plenty of different countries. Again, the definition of government shutdown is when a government must stop performing some or all of its services because it cannot pay the people to do those tasks anymore. And government shutdowns really highlight something I think is important that most people don't talk about, that governments only have power insofar as they have spending power, which means purchasing power. And this is why fiat currencies, like the dollar and every currency today, allow for so much growth, so much abuse, so much waste, and so much expansion of tyrannical government power. Because it essentially gives governments the ability to spend any amount they want. They don't have to directly tax people or borrow from people with a promise to pay back. If you can spend through the power of the printing press, you can steal purchasing power away from everybody else's money without them knowing it in real time. Then when people go to the grocery store and the gas pump and realize they can't afford their cost of living anymore, many people blame it on corporatism, capitalism, greedy CEOs, and are completely unaware that they are just paying the price of a too large tyrannical government who's been stealing their purchasing power through inflation. But if the government takes that too far and does that too much, eventually the people do wake up and realize, and they just stop accepting that currency for payment. This has happened again. Many times throughout history, that's what it means when a currency fails. Nobody will take it for payment anymore. And once nobody will accept that currency for payment anymore, that means the government has no more power because all of the people they pay to do their stuff, all of their enforcers, all of their regulators, all of their paper stampers, all of their clocker inners and clocker outers suddenly won't show up to work anymore. And the government then shuts down until one of two things happens. Either, number one, the government figures out a new way to get their hands on the form of money that people will accept as payment. And many times this is a form of money that government cannot control, which means they can no longer silently steal purchasing power through inflation. Or number two, this happens as well. A new government steps into place who has a form of spending power that the people will accept. So those are the three forms of government shutdowns, but I just want to bring this down to a personal finance example because especially the debt ceiling issue versus the budget issue, they can get conflated a little bit, they can get a little bit overlapped and confusing. I want to make it very simple here. Imagine you and your spouse sit down in order to decide where you're going to spend your money. You're going to make a budget. Now, all of the super important stuff that you have to spend your money on is decided already. You're gonna make your car payments, you're gonna pay your mortgage, you're gonna pay your utilities. That's not what you're deciding on here. That stuff is happening already automatically. What you are deciding on is your fun money. Are we gonna go out? Are we gonna go out to eat? Are we gonna go party? Are we gonna buy stuff on Amazon? Are we just gonna go to Costco every weekend? Because you know that'll soak up all your fun money. Are we gonna buy clothes? Are we gonna redo the kitchen? You're trying to figure out, with the extra leftover money that we have to spend, what are we gonna spend it on? Now, the key thing here is you don't have any money in your savings account. You don't have any money in your checking account. This is all going on a credit card anyway, but you've just already pre-decided that you're gonna spend more on your credit card. So now you guys are just arguing about what to spend that credit card money on. Now, if you guys can't come to a decision on what you're gonna spend that credit card money on, well, you don't spend it, obviously, because you haven't come to an agreement yet. And so the restaurants don't get you spending your credit card money there, or the clothes stores don't get you, or Costco, or wherever it was that you might come to an agreement on in the future. None of them get your money yet until you guys come to a decision on where to spend it. That's an example of a budget shutdown. Now let's say you and your spouse have agreed where to spend your money, your fun money from your credit card. So you guys go out, you party, you go get some drinks, you get some good food. You're at the end of the night, you've spent a ton of money, you've had a great time. The waiter brings you the bill and it's a little larger than you expected, but it's okay. You hand in the card and the card gets declined. So you look it up and realize, uh-oh, our card is already maxed out. We don't even have the limit on our card to be able to spend this money. Yes, we already voted on it together. Yes, we already decided what we were going to spend the money on. And yes, we already spent the money, or we spent the money. We got the services. They delivered the stuff to us. Now we go to swipe our credit card. Our credit limit, our debt limit has been reached. So now we're on the phone with our credit card company trying to convince them to increase our credit limit. Now in this case, Uncle Sam got a lot of sway. They're eventually going to increase the credit limit no matter what. But there's a period of time there where the spending shuts off because that credit limit has been reached. That is a debt ceiling budget government shutdown. And the third example with a currency failure shutdown, this would be like for the last couple of decades, you and your spouse have just not been working for income to spend. You've just been printing, counterfeiting money from your printer at home this entire time. You just print out $100 bills. Use that for all of your expenses. Use that to pay your mortgage. Use that to pay for your groceries. Use that for your fun money. You've just been counterfeiting money and spending printed money this whole entire time. Eventually though, somebody finds out. Once everybody finds out, nobody will accept your fake money anymore. So you're left with a choice. You can either go get a job and have somebody pay you real money for real services that you provide, and then you can use that new real money for your expenses, or you can just roll over and die. Gruesome, but again, we're talking about governments here. Of those three examples, the one that they're facing right now is the budget one, where the couple's just trying to decide where to spend their fun money. And again, this is just being inflated. It's just being printed, just being borrowed or taken from you from your paycheck. Now, what are the consequences of a government shutdown? Well, really in the long term, none, because these government shutdowns always do get resolved and they're not a result of a currency failure, at least not yet. And so because they're a budget issue right now, sometimes they're the debt ceiling issue. They get resolved. Really, there's no long-term consequences. If the debt ceiling issue goes on long enough, obviously debt default, that would be, disastrous for the dollar and the government. But assuming it doesn't go that far long-term, there's really no consequences. One consequence is government waste gets increased a lot because they still always back pay everything that they weren't able to pay. So everybody just gets a free vacation. All the government employees that weren't able to go to work and they weren't getting their paychecks in the meantime, they get back paid for not having to do any work. There's also a lot of regulatory friction and burden on this because there's a lot of people who weren't able to get business permits approved. There's backlogs and things take longer to happen. So there is a real cost on the economy, but overall, usually it's fairly negligible. And then finally, specifically one that we're facing right now here, one of the consequences is potentially delays in gathering and reporting economic data like jobs data or inflation data, which again, in the short term might have some consequences, but over the long term, really nothing. It'll smooth out. This means that consequences on the market are likely at worst some volatility in the short term. If the government shutdown does continue, economic data doesn't come out, and then when it does come out, it's a surprise. It's different than what people were expecting. There's a chance for short-term volatility here, but overall the markets are forward-looking machines. And so something like a temporary government shutdown shouldn't provide too much of a long-term consequence on the market. Okay, two final notes here, gridlock and the big beautiful bill. So number one, gridlock. A lot of people look at situations like this and they just get fed up. They're like, man, I wish we just had an efficient government. I wish we just had an effective government. I wish we just had people in power who would just do the thing that needs to get done. And there wasn't so much disagreement, wasn't so much gridlock. We could just do things. And I would be careful for what you're wishing for if you've had that thought before, because there are three things that make an effective government: perfect information, perfect morality, and perfect or all power. Most people ignore the first two and focus only on the power thing, only on the control thing. I wish the government could just do the thing that needs to be done. Wish it could just be efficient and effective at doing something, accomplishing things, building things. That's a power issue. People, if you boil that down to what you're actually saying, you want the government to have the ability to just make things happen. That's power. But power by itself is extremely dangerous and destructive unless it's paired with the other two things: perfect morality and perfect information. Because if you have somebody who has all the power and can just make anything happen, but they are immoral, or at least they are selfish, or doing things to benefit some people close to them and not everybody else, it's gonna be a very bad situation. You wouldn't want that person to have power. And those people who are like that are gonna be most drawn to that kind of power. But guess what? Even if you have somebody who you give them all the power and they're perfectly moral, if they don't have all the perfect, correct information, then they're going to be making incorrect decisions that will lead to waste or abuse or inefficiencies or destruction. And so you have to have all three. You have to have perfect information, perfect morality, and perfect power in order to have a perfectly effective government. And none of those things are possible, which is why the founding fathers designed our government to be gridlocked. You have checks and balances on power. You have separations of power. So the people who are carrying out the law are different from the people who are making the law, are different from the people who are interpreting the law. You have all of these things so that there's gridlock, so that it is hard for the government to get more power. It is hard for the government to do things, because a government that is really easy and good at actually accomplishing things, the power aspect, attracts the wrong people to do the wrong things. And if your system relies on the right person being in power, it will crumble because eventually the wrong person will be in power. And a system designed with gridlock will only accomplish things when there is widespread agreement that it is the correct thing to accomplish. And we see that when there is really a lot of widespread agreement that our nation should do one thing or the other, that's the direction that it goes. But when there's not widespread agreement, that's when that disagreement happens, and the gridlock is very easy, which is a good thing. It prevents abuse. Now, the counterpoint to this is that it allows a monster of tyranny to grow over time, because little by little, you can grow your power, and the gridlock works both ways. So it's difficult to reduce that power, just as difficult as it is to increase it. And so you end up with this monster bureaucracy that is tyrannical and too big and just spiraling forward. And because the gridlock, it's hard to undo that. And that is a huge problem. But at the very least, that gridlock also prevents it from getting bigger even faster. And then the last thing I mentioned is the big beautiful bill. Why are we facing a budget issue if they just passed the big beautiful bill? Big beautiful bill was not actually a budget bill. Every year they have to come up with their budget, say where they're going to spend all the money for the year. The big beautiful bill was a lot more about the mandatory spending. It had tax policy in it. It was just a generalized bill. It was not the specific appropriations voting that they have to be doing right now. So while some of the big picture stuff was already decided on, they have to still do the budget every year, basically. And that's what they're facing right now. If you found this video helpful and you'd like to see more stuff from me that I don't post about on YouTube, I have a free newsletter, and all you have to do to start getting it in your inbox every week, click on the link in the description below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.